Hi and welcome to How to Make This Air Elemental. This is the Wizkid's Pathfinder Deepcuts Greater Air Elemental Lord. I've whipped it up for Paint to Life episode 71, which you can find here or in the description below if you didn't see the episode. I'm going to go through my thought process on how I came about this model, what I decided to do with it, and kind of how I went about making an adaptation from my original plan. Here's the paint list you can follow. Very simple, not very many paints in this one. So started to sketch it out. I was going to use an XPS foam base, and I wanted to kind of create the effect of a tornado rampaging across the landscape. So I broke the model off of its base so that it was just the clear plastic, and began work with my hot wire foam cutter to cut out a square of the XPS foam. This model separates from its base quite easily, and there's really not much to it. As you can see here, it's just a solid clear piece of plastic. So with the pencil, I'm going to sketch out the direction this creature is going to be traveling, and this is where I'm going to be gouging out for a little bit of a sunken area for its path. This is one of the fatty attachments. It quickly melts the foam. Make sure you're wearing a mask or have ventilation because it's pretty stinky and likely toxic. But I'm just melting down here so that I'll have some depression that I can paint to look like it's churning up the earth as it travels along. And you can see some of the whiffs of smoke coming out of this here. If you don't have a hot wire foam cutter, I definitely suggest that if you're going to do any kind of base work with XPS foam, it's pretty much a game changer in the things that it lets you do. In a lot of Paint to Life episodes, I've made full use of this and the various tools that come with it. For a plug-in one runs you $50. If you're into the modeling hobby, I'd strongly suggest investing in one. So I'm just trying to make it look a little less perfect around the edges, wipe off my tip with the melted, and there we are. So now I'm using some milliput to build up the flat sections. This is all going to be covered eventually anyways, but I don't ever like to make ground without having some kind of topographical nuance, so that, like bumps and hills. Obviously we have our depression with the hot wire foam cutter. Now we're going to have these little hills made out of milliput, which when they dry, they'll be on there like as good as cement. Milliput's really easy to sculpt with your fingers and some water. Adds a little bit of a lip to this, and it's fun to use. Okay, so now in my plan, I wanted to use some popsicle sticks to make like a wooden building. I like the idea of this tornado kind of sucking up the boards of the barn and having them flying around, so I was going to make a corner and have it all destroyed. But clearly, as you'll see as I'm building this, I quickly realized the scale of the elemental with the size of the building just wouldn't work. If this is a Dungeons & Dragons mini, you put one up against it. This is a huge creature, so it's probably about 18 to 20 feet tall, but the building height would be minuscule compared to it, so it would be more of an outhouse if I was to keep going along this path. As you can see, I was trying to build a wall using popsicle sticks and staging it so that it would harden, and I would paint it and then break it and include it with the elemental, but ultimately I had to drop this idea. So now I'm painting my base while my sticks dry. Maybe I hadn't decided I was dropping it yet at this point. This is just a great Mod Podge craft paint blend. It seals the XPS foam so that you can prime it. You can spray paint it with a rattle can without it melting. It also seals in any grit, gravel, and sand, which I'm also about to use here. So putting a little bit of sand. I didn't film this, but you can see I've put sand, some brown battleground rocks, some Army Painter battlefield rocks, and then just small gravel from outside. I dumped it all in there, as you can see, including the sand, because once this is all primed, that looks like a better base than what I had just out of the foam and milliput. So here I realized this barn isn't going to work. It's too small. There's no flat space. So instead, I'm going to make a big tree. So Luke Towan's YouTube channel has this tutorial on how to make a wire tree out of floral wire. So I went, grabbed the floral wire, and started twisting and turning while watching TV one night until I had this little bit of a tree skeleton, which you see here. So I coated it using a liquid latex, which I never used before, which you can get from a craft store like Michael's, and basically you just paint this liquid latex over everything. Now I've used Green Stuff World's liquid latex before, and if you've watched my videos, you'll see me. It looks green, and this stuff works very similarly, except it's much thicker, and I have a whole like gallon of it there. Well, not a gallon, but whatever that is, a quart. I have a lot of it, and I found it's much runnier than the Green Stuff World, which dries a lot quicker and a translucent green. But for this project, it was perfect. Yeah, it was very runny. Maybe there's a way I could thicken it, but I just applied it in light coats. Let it dry, come back again, let it dry. You know, if it dripped, trim some of it off, went at it again, and just kind of so on and so forth. Hitting this tree with enough liquid latex so that the wires are completely hidden. They're firmed up so they don't twist and fall, because they look like little branches. And once enough coats are applied, it looks proper. In fact, the gooey bubbliness of it actually lends itself to an actual armature, like a tree, where there would be knots and branch stems and bubbles. So not bubbles, but like, you know, knuckles, if you will. So that's how I made this tree. And there's the finished application of one coat here, and here's what the tree looked like when it was done. So once it's done, it's nice and firm, and I can prime it. So I primed it with black paint, just using a Citadel rattle can of Chaos Black, and now some Baneblade Brown as my base coat. As you can see, the latex holds the paint, held the primer beautifully, and holds the browns as well as I kind of work up on it. Next, I'm going to use a Dark Oath Flesh in my airbrush, just to give it varying colors, so it would look a little more natural than just a solid color. And when that's done, some clump foliage, also known as nugs, just a little bit of spray adhesive, and dunk the tree in the nugs to get your tree. So now I prime my base with the Chaos Black, now that I've sealed it with the Mod Podge craft paint, and a little extra milliput around the base of the tree to look like earth that's being torn up as the tree is being tipped over from the winds. So a little Mournfang brown in the airbrush to start on my base, basically repainting it the same kind of brown it was before I primed it. So now, after I put a little base brown of Mournfang, it's time for some static grass application. Now, I've used a static grass applicator before, but it was battery powered, and even though it seemed to have a good shock to it, I was never really happy with the results. I found a lot of my time was spent doing manual adjustments to the work afterwards. So I went out and bought a static grass applicator that plugs into the wall. And this one has true current to it, not just batteries. And so I've set my glue, and now I'm going to plug in a pin, and using a foliage in Green Stuff World foliage, using this one, I'm going to start to shake it. Now, using this was interesting because I'm using this True Power, whatever grass applicator says on the screen, but it's getting weird effects. Some of areas were working really well and some weren't. In fact, I started almost hearing a humming sound as the electricity coursed through the plastic. And this is the beginning of my learning. As you can see, it was working. There's a clear electrical field there. What's that tree made out of again? Oh, right, floral wire. Shaking the statically charged applicator beside the wire in the tree was causing it to short out. And right there is where I got the shock of my life. So, note to self, when using a static grass applicator, do not use it around wire trees with wire in the armatures. Nevertheless, I survived to fight another day. Did a little bit of touch-up work with the areas that the tree was throwing off. Used my wife's toothbrush to kind of clean up some of the grass that went down into the path area, which I had depressed, which worked out nicely. So a little bit of Gorthor brown dry brushing just to give a couple two tones on that dirt. And the grass mixture that I used was pretty decent. I added a little more flex. You can see the nugs on the wire armatures of the tree. And the tree, this is a top-down angle, so it's not as easy to see, but it is bending on like a 45-degree angle away from the elemental. So there's some touch-ups on the ground. And then we're going to use some Doombow brown as well to add a couple more elements of earth. the sunken areas. Basically, I was just darkening them after I had lightened the tops using a dry brush. It was a little too light, so I darkened some of the sunken areas as I thought maybe needed a little more shadow, I guess. So once that was finished, a little bit of green, a little bit of glue, some dabbing on glue here. I was going to put a little more rocks, some shrubbery, grassy tufts, highland tufts. Basically, my favorite part about doing bases in anything like this is there's no real rhyme or reason to it. You just do what you think looks good. Nature, by its nature, is chaotic and not organized, so you can just throw anything on there that looks good. You want to make it busy because a field would be busy. You don't want it to just be a flat grass. So I've got rocks. I added more diverse grasses with the applicator on the one side. I used some leaf litter from Green Stuff World. Also some shrubbery, some flowers. Built it all up and kept it handy, because after this I'm gonna have to work on the air elemental. I also went out and grabbed some twigs, things from outside that would give it definitely a more nature look, and basically just started placing all those on in anywhere that looked good over the period of a few days. You know, it's best to let the glue dry. Don't try and rush this. I know you can use a hairdryer to clean things up and dry things up, but as you see, it's best to, you know, put some on, let it dry, make sure it's nice and hard, apply some watered down glue, some IPA glue, tasty stuff, with a little bit of water and a little tad of rubbing alcohol to break the surface tension. Just squirt it on there just to make sure it seals everything in. You don't want so much that it dries clear, you don't want so much that it dries cloudy or looks like there's glue there, but you definitely don't want to rush these steps where you do a bunch and you only wait 45 minutes and then you start doing more, because then the stuff underneath isn't really sealed and it'll start to peel up and look bad. So do a bit, wait a day, do some more, wait a day if you have the time. And this time-lapse video here was over I think this was one session, but the finished product was over at least 3 days. And you can see, add more glue where needed. That glue that I'm using there is like a watered down version of the glue, as I mentioned, just so it can permeate the cracks, and make sure you seal and all that good stuff. So now it's on to paint this big boy. Now as you see, I've broken him off his base. I'm using a Doom Bull Brown. He's not primed. The paint slides a little bit. It's a little watery. But I really like the elemental being fully clear like this, but obviously I need to do something to him. And around his base he has, well, I shouldn't say he, I guess it's an it, but around its base it has like this splash, which is dirt and things it's pulling up. So basically I'm using a mixture, a blend of the colors that I painted the earth on my diorama. The Doom Bull Brown went on first because that was the darker color, and then up to Bane Blade Brown, etc. Any browns will work. It's up to you. Maybe it's a desert elemental, so you're going to use sand colors. When it was done, it kind of looked like that, like a chocolate cake topper. So now I was going to use some Basilicanum Gray. Wow. With some contrast medium. I wanted to thin out the gray. I did not want this guy to turn into a gray. I wanted to keep as much of the transparency as I could. You can see top down there how just translucent he is, but as I apply this powdery gray cut with the contrast medium, makes it go on a little more transparent than it would be normally. And I used this little spinny Lazy Susan to get 360-degree coverage, focusing more in some areas than others. I still wanted it to be transparent, but you don't want to put so much on that the paint beads up and runs watery, like I just did there on his hands. You want to make sure you're applying it evenly and thin so it doesn't goop up. I used that brush there to wipe off any excess. So once it was done, I hit him with a blast of white ink in various angles from the top, just to kind of make these condensed clouds and give them like a powdery, as someone mentioned, Stay Puft Marshmallow look. A little more Basilicanum Gray in the eye sockets and mouth sockets, just so that it dries, but not solid. I don't want to put black in there. And I debated putting some little pinpoints of red in there, like my colleague suggested, but I wanted to keep it as natural as possible with no unnatural colors. Okay, so now onto some Sterling Mud. I used a little bit of this on the base. Mostly it was the XPS foam and the sand and the stuff I primed on, but for this base I don't have the luxury of those, so Sterling Mud is a good technical paint, you apply it with a junk brush because you don't want it to clog up a good brush. That's why I have a piece of tape around mine. But this dries peppery with little chunks in it, and it, you know, I'm also painting over a lot of the other colors. That's okay, because when it's done, it'll give it texture just like the base. Now, one other thing I forgot to mention, I decided this go around to keep this miniature separate from the base. I always make these bases with Paint to Life, and they're great, except if I ever want to use a greater air elemental in my D&D campaigns, I really can't, because I've locked them into these dioramas. So this particular guy, I glued onto his clear base, and I'm just setting him on the diorama. Not with magnets, not with glue, just set, so it looks cool when he's on his diorama base, but I can also take him away and put him on my game table and use him if I ever need an air elemental. So now that all those elements are put on the bottom, he has a real good chocolate look to that base. And now it's time to make this air elemental alive. Using a brush and some straight white glue, PVA glue, I'm going to follow two of these trails, these contrails up his body, around his waist, over his shoulders. Make sure you stay with the right one. You don't want to cross the lines and bump over. They're very nice indentations in the model itself to follow. It's a very highly detailed model. And then just start applying grit. You want to make sure you apply smallest to largest. There should be more small than there is large, but you don't want too much. You don't want it to look like a belt. You don't want it to look like a brown belt, which it does look like here, admittedly, I agree. But it will come off a bit. I'm going to use a brush when it dries to scrape some of that off, because you don't want it to be too much. And here I am lessening some of it. It was a little too intense. It's supposed to be just picked up by the air. So by scraping some of it off with this brush and pushing it around so that only a few pebbles remain, plus they spill off outside of the lines to make sure they don't look too solid. A couple also things, there's some mold lines on this guy's shoulders where you can see them there on that cloud where his arms were glued into his torso. I'm going to paint over those as well and cover them with stuff, so ultimately he won't have any mold lines. A couple dots of PVA glue solid and some bigger pebbles now. Again, we're working our way up from just having the grit to some of the bigger pebbles and then a stone here and there. Basically, it's the same material you used for the basing of our diorama, and now we're putting it on the elemental itself. This was really well received from the painting community and the places where I posted it. Everyone really liked the idea of working in the ground. Some people suggested he shouldn't be so cloud colored, like maybe I should have made him more brown, like a dust devil, which, you know what, teach their own, and that would have probably looked awesome too. Now I'm also adding a little grass around the base of the tuft, trying not to get too much on his body. There would be some. It's mostly that grassy base because that's what he's ripping up right now. So now you see these are the shoulders I mentioned where the lines are. Finishing out with some hands, adding more, and then basically just having fun with it. So once he was finished, this is how he looked. The finished tree, a lot of the basing that I put, the odd rock on his back, as well as some of the stuff on his shoulders, covering those lines. I like the idea that even though he's not an earth elemental, he's controlling the wind. He's got a lot of debris in his hand, like a gauntlet almost, because he's going to swing it and get extra power from all those chunks. There's our nug tree tipping over. You can see underneath it there as it's being ripped out of the ground and the roots. Would have been cool to do the building, but the building would have had to been so much bigger to make it to scale. And you can also see the elemental itself on its clear disc, so I can take it off of this should I need to play with the mini in my D&D game. So there's the 360 degree view, and this is Cumulus, one of the elementals from the elemental plane of air, one of the elemental lords. If you want to hear how to use an elemental or get some ideas of an elemental you can use in your D&D campaign, check out Paint to Life episode 71. Again, it's linked here, where you can find out the story of Cumulus, how he came to be, amongst other things. So thank you very much for spending your time with me here today. I'm going to be making a bunch of more videos coming up. We got some dragons on the go. I also have a fire elemental, an earth elemental, in the same ilk as this guy, the huge from Pathfinder, battles Deepcuts from Wizkids. Great models, and I'll be around to make those. So keep watching the channel. Again, like, share, and subscribe if you haven't yet already. Pass this along to anyone who you think might like it. And I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Hope you had a good time making your own version of Cumulus. I'm GMA Tank. Wash your hands, people.